In 1766, Joseph-Marie Amiot, who lived from 1718 to 1793, a Jesuit missionary resident in Beijing, sent the first installment of what would later become his Art militaire des Chinois to Paris, to his friend Henri Bertin, the French Controller General and Minister of State. Amiot's complete corpus of 6 Chinese military texts, translated into French, was published in Paris in 1772. It was reprinted in 1782 in volume 7 of the monumental Jesuit encyclopedia Mémoires, concernant l'histoire, les sciences, les arts, les mœurs, les usages, etc. des Chinois, with a supplement that appeared in volume 8 of the same set, also published in 1782. Though 4 of the treatises Amiot translated were more than 2,000 years old, they were regarded as classics, and some of them had been reprinted in China in the early 18th century. Amiot translated 4 of the 7 classic Chinese military texts, the best known of which is Sunzi's The Art of War from the 5th century B.C.E. Only one of these classical texts, the Wu-Tse of Wu-Qi, mentions the trumpet, though drums and the lo, a gong-like instrument, are mentioned occasionally in 3 of the 4 classical texts. Amiot also translated 2 more recent texts, one of them the 10 Precepts of the Yongzheng Emperor, who reigned from 1722 to 1735. The other more recent text is entitled, in French translation, Instructions sur l'exercice militaire. Probably this is a translation of a Chinese treatise from the 17th century or the early 18th, but so far, no one has been able to identify the Chinese source. It is this treatise, however, that is of the greatest interest for my purposes, since it includes copious references to trumpets and percussion instruments. Before we delve into Amiot's translation of Instructions sur l'exercice militaire and the references to trumpets and percussion therein, I want to offer a thumbnail sketch of the history of Chinese military instruments, particularly the lip-blown aerophones. It must be said at the outset that source material on such instruments in China is rather meager. Trumpets were largely considered to be signal instruments, and they probably played at most 2 or 3 different pitches. Very few Chinese trumpets and drums made before the 19th century survive. There are, however, 3 trumpets from prehistoric times, 2 made of animal horn, 1 of pottery from the 5th century and 6th centuries, the Common Era. And from that time, we have works of art that show trumpets and drums and horns. 2 clay tiles excavated from a 6th dynasty's tomb near Dongxian in Henan province, south of Beijing, show 2 groups of trumpeters. Each group forms a small chueda, or blowing and hitting band, comprised of wind and percussion instruments. The band on the first of these 2 slides shows 2 trumpeters, their instruments probably made of metal, and 2 drummers. Each of the drummers is multitasking. With the right hand, each plays a medium-sized drum, perhaps a biangu, suspended from his body. With the left hand, each holds 3 small drums suspended on a stick, collectively called taogu or bolongu. Attached to each of the 3 small drums are cords with pellets on their ends. When the drummer shakes the stick, the pellets hit the drumhead. The musicians in this chueda band are well liveried. Each wears a uniform consisting of matching trousers, tunics, and hats. Streamers trail from the bells of the trumpets. The second tile shows another chueda band from the same tomb. This one consists of 5 musicians. In the lead is a player of a transverse flute or dizi, followed by a player of the paishao or panpipes. Next come the 2 trumpeters, with a player of a small end-blown wind instrument bringing up the rear. This instrument may be a bili a small double reed instrument with finger holes. This Chueda band is also well liveried, though their uniforms differ somewhat from those of the first group. These trumpets are similar to those in the first style, but they are held down to the side, not up in the air, and they have no streamers. The Buddhist paintings in the Mogao caves near Dunhuang in Gansu province are by far the richest source of iconography for musical instruments from the Tang Dynasty, which lasted from 618 to 907 of the Common Era. Approximately 4,000 musical instruments are depicted in these murals, but there are only a handful of representations of lip-blown aerophones. Conch shell trumpets appear in a few of the ensembles that accompany dancers. The most striking illustration of trumpets appears in a mural in Mogao Cave 156, which depicts the victory of General Zhang Yiqiao over a Tibetan army in 848 of the Common Era. The two trumpets are probably made of animal horn, and they appear to have some sort of painted decoration. Next to the trumpeters are two players of kettle drums, similar in appearance to Middle Eastern nakers. Perhaps these instruments reached China along the Silk Road, which ran right through Dunhuang. The next two slides show two different trumpets described and illustrated in Chen Yang's Yueshu, or music book, completed in 1101 during the Song Dynasty, but not published until 1199. The two instruments are the curved Tongzhao and the straight Jingjiao. The Tongzhao looks like an instrument made of animal horn, though the word tong means copper in modern Chinese. Moving on to the Ming Dynasty, 1368 to 1644, we find a few representations of trumpets in works of art. An undated mural in the Fire God Temple in Yanqing District, northwest of Beijing, shows a trumpeter, a drummer, and a banner bearer supporting an artillery unit. The trumpet is long and probably made of metal. A drawing of an army, possibly preparing for battle, from an edition of the 14th century Chinese novel Water Margin, shows four military musicians, one with a long trumpet, one with a large drum, another with a gong, and a fourth musician, possibly playing a short trumpet, though the instrument might be a suona or Chinese shang. The next slide, from a painted scroll, shows a military band of the Ming Dynasty wolf troop. Wolf troops were comprised of soldiers recruited typically from the Yao and Zhuang minority peoples in southern China. They were famous for their ferocity, but notorious for their lack of discipline. Once again, the trumpets are long, straight instruments. Moving along to the last imperial dynasty of China, the Qing, 1644 to 1912, we finally come to Amiot's translation of Chinese military texts. As I mentioned earlier, the most copious information on military trumpets and percussion in Amiot's book appears in his translation of Instructions sur l'exercice militaire. This text was aimed at armies consisting of soldiers with only a sword for a weapon and a buckler for protection. A buckler is a small shield. Amiot says that the, quote, drums and other military instruments take the place of the voice of the general, close quote. The troops, he says, must give the general their immediate attention, and I quote, at the first beat of the drum, the troops redouble their attention and all are immediately ready. After the first beat of the drum, the trumpet blows a single tone 3 times, but each tone is sustained and prolonged. The time between each repetition of the tone should be no longer than the time required to take a breath. After the trumpets have stopped, one hears anew the beat of the drum while the troops depart to the right and the left. They form 2 lines precisely straight and parallel, close quote. Amiot's translation of the exercice includes 28 illustrations of military formations. 9 of these illustrations, like the one in this slide, show drums, tambour. Only 2 of them show trumpets, though another 12 illustrations show the position of a signal tower where the drums were stationed. I have found no examples of the instrument called lo in any of these formations, though the figures are so small that it's difficult to confirm this. The lo, however, is mentioned frequently in the treatise's list of 111 different exercises. Many of the exercises described in this text are rather simplistic as concerns the beating of the drum or the lo and the blowing of the trumpet. Exercise number 2, however, is more explicit about the technique for the drum. Quote, one beats double strokes very lightly on the sides of the drum. As the soldiers squat, they rise up and make some revolutions with their swords and bucklers, close quote. The following exercise adds the trumpet to this movement. Quote, one plays a note on the trumpet. Immediately afterward, there is a stroke on the drum. At this moment, the soldiers stop their revolutions. They remain standing in good bearing, holding their swords and bucklers above their heads in the position of attack or defense, and all together make a loud cry, close quote. The elaborate formations shown in the accompanying illustrations were intended for the parade ground, not the battlefield. To some extent, they resemble choreographies, and this serves as a reminder that the courts of both the Ming and Qing dynasties were deeply invested in ritual, and that some of these rituals were military in nature and were carefully choreographed. Near the end of Amiot's translation of the Exercice, there are several more plates showing an array of military paraphernalia, including weapons, banners, clothing, tools, and musical instruments. In plate 18, figure 1 is a metal gong-like instrument called chinlo, or simply lo. In a footnote, Amiot says of this instrument, quote, the lo is an instrument of brass approximately 2 feet in diameter. I speak of the principal lo because there are some smaller ones. This organologist A.C. Moule says that the lo, quote, is beaten with a wooden stick with a head of plaited string or rags, sometimes covered with cloth or leather. The best gongs are said to be made in Suzhou. The metal is called huangtong, or sounding brass, and is said to be composed of copper and brass with perhaps 5% of tin. The ordinary gongs are said to be hammered when the metal is red hot and not cast, as has sometimes been stated, end of quote. The 2 drums in plate 18 are designated for different purposes. They look quite similar, though the one on the right is more elaborately decorated. Amiot tells us that the 2 trumpets are pitched in an octave apart. He says, quote, figures 4 and 5 in this illustration represent the 2 types of trumpets in use among the troops. They are pitched an octave apart. The one in figure 4 is approximately in unison with our corps de chasse. Corps de chasse seems referring to French hunting horns, and that in figure 5 is an octave lower than the first. Both are made of beaten metal and each weighs 7 pounds, but they differ in their shape and construction, as one can see. Each trumpet costs 1 tael, 7 chien, 6 fen. Odd for Amiot to include the prices of these instruments in his report. From surviving examples of the Xiao Tongzhao shown on the far right, we can be reasonably certain that the shorter of Amiot's 2 trumpets is telescoping. A similar instrument in the Metropolitan Museum of New York is 98.3 centimeters long when fully extended, 59.4 centimeters when closed. Extending the bell of the instrument does not affect the pitch. As Moule states, quote, the sliding tubes of these instruments are not intended to change the notes, but to reduce their length when they are not in use. Shops devoted to the making of these horns are found in Suzhou, a place noted for the manufacture of brass instruments. Quote, close quote. Both of Amiot's trumpets have bosses at 2 points in the main tube. While his information lacks sufficient detail to tell much about the mouthpiece of either instrument, we may infer from surviving exemplars that it had a broad, flat rim with a shallow cup. Further military percussion instruments appear in Amiot's plate 22. Of these instruments, Amiot writes, quote, "Figure 1 is a metal gong or an instrument called the Chinese call lo. It is used in nearly the same way as the drum or tambour. Figure 2 represents another instrument, which one strikes with 2 sticks. It is made of sonorous wood, hollow inside, and in the shape of a fish. It is attached by 2 rings, as can be seen. The instrument is placed at the entrance of the general's tent, those of the general officers, and all those who serve as inspectors. When there is some business to be communicated to them, one strikes this instrument. One is then certain to have an immediate audience." Figure 3 shows a conch. It serves for sounding a retreat, to signal the exercise, and for the entire operation, for which an entire corps must be employed. There is one of these conches in each quarter of the army and in each particular corps. These conches also take the place of a megaphone. I have heard it played, and I can confirm that its sounds are very melodious. End of quote. As we have seen, Amiot illustrates 2 types of military trumpet, one long with a flared bell, the other an octave higher with cylindrically shaped expansion at its bell end. Some of these instruments survive in museums in China, the United States, and Europe, and all appear to be from the 19th century. A few surviving examples are in curved form. One unusual curved Chinese trumpet has a double bell. It is in the Boston Museum of Fine Arts. Historically, Chinese trumpets were typically used for military purposes, though we have evidence from the 18th century that they were also used in court rituals. There is evidence from the 20th century that in rural areas, trumpets were used in weddings and funerals. We have seen that in earlier times, some trumpets were made of animal horn, and also that conch shells were occasionally used as trumpets, even in military contexts. Since the 19th century, Chinese trumpets have generally been made of metal, but in the Chinese military of today, they have valves. Traditional natural trumpets of any kind are rare in 21st century China. Thank you for your attention.